Hello and welcome back to my Flock and Squawk. I'm Sydney, and today we are going to be talking about chocolate chip cookie recipes. Obviously, if you're new to my channel, you may not know, but I have been baking chocolate chip cookies and posting other recipe type videos in the past, but it hasn't been at the forefront of my channel for a little bit. So let's just get started. I baked the original chocolate chip cookie recipe a while back compared to the modern day Nestle recipe that comes on the back of the chocolate chip package, and had a friend compare them. And then I also had baked up chocolate chip cookie pre-made mix and pre-made dough, also as a comparison that I had my friend rate. I was trying to do like a chocolate chip cookie showdown to figure out which one would be considered the best by a blind taste test. Obviously, it has been quite a while since I last did those, and I am not really reviving that series at the moment. But what I am interested in still is chocolate chip cookies. So I went through all of my cookbooks. This is, a variety of ages. I believe the newest recipe is 2011, or newest cookbook that contained a chocolate chip cookie recipe was 2011. So I went through all of the cookbooks that I have, and I found the chocolate chip cookie recipes, and I put them in a spreadsheet. My spreadsheet does not currently contain the original recipe for chocolate chip cookies that is presented on the Wikipedia page and that I made, or the one off the back of the chocolate chip cookie package, or chocolate chip package from Nestle. But I have some very interesting findings from this spreadsheet, so let's take a look into it. So obviously there are a lot of variations in recipes in general, no matter what it is, unless it is something super basic like pasta or bread. There are tons of variations, and even within pasta and bread, like the most basic form, I am sure there are variations on the amount of water that one person uses compared to another. But generally, those are very simplistic, mastered recipes. They don't have too crazy a variation because you know that this much flour to this much water to this much salt, yeast, so on. So chocolate chip cookies are a little more complex, and I was interested in what variations are there. Is there a recipe that completely excludes one thing that is consistent through all the rest? So I went through and I looked for a commonality. What makes the chocolate chip cookie a chocolate chip cookie recipe? What is there that is the same between all of these recipes? And I found my answer. It is an egg. Basically, every recipe has an egg. There is one recipe that calls for 2 full eggs, and one recipe that calls for 1 egg and a whole yolk. But all of these 13 recipes do call for an egg. On the other end of the spectrum, only one of the recipes that I found in my cookbooks to put in my spreadsheet called for any amount of water. This is from Nestle themselves in a pamphlet recipe. It calls for 1/4 teaspoon of water. That is the only recipe that made it to my spreadsheet at the moment that contains any additional water. As for chocolate chips, it seems that pretty universally they want about a cup. There are a couple that request 1 cup and 1 1/4 cups. There are a couple that require 1/2 cup or 3/4 cup. One that requires 2 cups of chocolate chips, and one that requires 3 cups of chocolate chips. Although those also make larger quantities of cookies. Most of the recipes did in fact call for nuts as well. That is something that I see as completely optional in a chocolate chip cookie, but the recipes did at least tell you how much of a nut to add. Most of them did not specify what kind of nut, but there were a few that specified that they preferred walnuts. And of the nuts, it usually seems to be about half a cup, with a couple being 3/4 cup, 1 cup, and then 1.5 cups for the larger quantity dough. Now, it may shock some people to find that I have a category on my spreadsheet for things that were not falling within the realm of, flour, butter, sugar. I just have a additions recipe. Now, I did not put nuts in this because nuts was a commonly listed ingredient. However, these things were not commonly listed ingredients for chocolate chip cookies for most of these recipes. So in Betty Crocker cookbook, there's the Good and Easy cookbook that I looked into, which I own, and then there is the Betty Crocker cookie book that I also own, which is a reprint from the 60s. Good and Easy is from, the copy I have is 1954, I believe. So both of those cookbooks have recipes for very quick and easy chocolate chip cookies. Very limited ingredients, but the commonality between both of those is that they call for Bisquick to make the process faster. Bisquick is just like a pancake mix, but doing it their way, you can make chocolate chip cookies out of it. It's very quick, easy, you barely need anything other than like eggs, chocolate chips, nuts, so on. So that is something I put into my additions spot on the spreadsheet, because it is not something that is normally in a chocolate chip cookie recipe, or normally in the ones that I looked at least. So those two Betty Crocker recipes, one from the 50s, one from the 60s, although my copy of the book is from a 2006? Let's see. It's a 2002 reprint. So there may be some changes along the way, but those both require Bisquick instead of flour. And then another recipe that has a differing addition is from the Cook's Illustrated Cookbook for their thin and crispy chocolate chip cookies. This cookbook had two separate cookie recipes that made it to the spreadsheet. One was for ultimate chocolate chip cookies. The other was for thin and crispy. Thin and crispy makes the addition of corn syrup and milk. So, to help them be thin and crispy, I assume. And then finally, a different recipe that has additions is from a 2003 book called Let's Cook Southern by Margaret Crawford. And this book is actually a compilation of recipes from a lot of different women and sources. But this recipe is actually listed as Margaret's own. She calls them her secret chocolate chip cookie recipe. But the additions that she makes to her chocolate chip cookies, which I'm debating on how well it fits into the spreadsheet, but she has 3 additions: lemon juice, cinnamon, and oatmeal. So, I obviously did not go searching for chocolate oat cookies, but since this was listed straight as a chocolate chip cookie, I included it in the spreadsheet. This is the only one that has oatmeal, or cinnamon for that matter, and definitely the only one that has lemon juice. So those are the alternatives, additions that came up in these 13 recipes. So the quantities vary widely, and I don't think that I've almost ever gotten a cookie recipe that was accurate on the quantity of cookies that I'd receive at the end of it, partly because I don't use necessarily the recommended roll into a 2-inch ball or use a teaspoon to drop onto the cookie sheet, because those just end up in very tiny cookies, which does add to the quantity. But it seems like we have everything from 50 2-inch cookies, where it specifies the size, to 6 dozen cookies, 16 large. There was one recipe from the 5-ingredient college cookbook that had no quantity listed. It did not list a quantity, and so I did not make up the recipe to try and see, because it did not specify either the size dough balls that you were to put on the baking sheet to bake. But I believe the smallest batch size of all these cookies is from Cook's Illustrated Cookbook, their Ultimate Chocolate Chip Cookie, which had 16 large cookies listed as the quantity. Next up, let's talk about temperature. So overall, it seems like there's a pretty standardized temperature of around 375 listed for these cookies. There are a couple times where it says 350, but majority says 375. For temperature, it seems that the most common is about 10 minutes. 8 to 10 minutes usually is what is listed on these cookbooks, apparently. Although we do have some outliers, there is one recipe that is from Golden Desserts, Every Recipe Pictured by Carol Hanslip. This is a 1984 edition of the book, and her cookies are 15 to 20 minutes bake time. And then Let's Cook Southern by Margaret Crawford is 16 to 18 minutes bake time. It seems there is the range between 8 to 14 minutes for chocolate chip cookies, which seems about right to my normal baking of cookies. Radar has joined us, and there is a mysterious beeping noise. I hope it is not too obnoxious. If I can, I will try and cut it out, if you even hear it. So, I have Radar. She is a very sweet kitten. Another common ingredient that does not seem to be one that is often referenced, or it seems like it's about 50-50, is vanilla extract. Now, I have always added vanilla to my chocolate chip cookies, which I feel like vanilla is a good thing to add to most baking recipes, or most cookie recipes. But it seems that there are 6 out of the 13 that forego mentioning or using vanilla extract. Next up, every single recipe calls for a form of butter or shortening. In my spreadsheet, I put it under the same thing because, to me, they're pretty interchangeable. To some people, they might not be as interchangeable on whether or not the recipe calls for shortening or butter. And I know there are probably people out there who only use shortening. But for me, in our house, we've always just used straight butter unless it was a special thing, or unless it was something out of the usual, like sometimes we use it for a pie crust. But it's one of those things that we don't really keep in the house because we always use butter. But it is interesting. The only thing of note is that one singular recipe requested that you melt and then cool the butter instead of just having softened butter. As for sugars, brown sugar is in almost every single recipe. There are, I believe, 2 recipes that go without it. Those are Golden Pictured by Carol Hanslip, and then the other one where brown sugar is foregone, it is the 5-ingredient college cookbook by Pamela. by Pamela Egling, which is actually the newest one, I believe. It is a 2017 book. I am sorry, Radar had launched herself from behind the camera straight onto my knee with claws, and now she's back cuddling in my lap. But it seems like there is almost always butter. Or no, almost always brown sugar. I'm sorry, Radar confused me. Next up, there is white sugar in almost every recipe, except for the ones that are Betty Crocker's cookie book for the quick and easy Bisquick version, as well as the good and easy Betty Crocker cookbook, which also forgoes white sugar, I assume because of the Bisquick. I have never really thought about it, but Bisquick must have white sugar in it, so that's why they forgo it, but they do have brown sugar. So. Next up, most recipes do call for salt, except for the Betty Crocker versions that use Bisquick. Baking powder is another ingredient that almost universally across the board is not used. Only one recipe uses baking powder. And in the recipe that uses baking powder, they do not use baking soda, which, according to my spreadsheet, almost everyone does, in fact, use baking soda. The exceptions being the Bisquick versions from Betty Crocker. Same thing goes with flour. Basically every recipe contains flour except for the Bisquick versions from Betty Crocker. So that is what my spreadsheet has found. It is really, there seem to be a lot of commonalities between these recipes. There are only a few things that are different other than the quantities that these recipes request that you use. So I mean, like baking times, baking temperatures, those are all very similar. They all, or the majority, flour, baking soda, brown sugar, butter, egg, chocolate chips, and most suggest nuts. So overall, I feel like it's very clear to see from just these 13 recipes that while there are a lot of variations, there are a ton of similarities to these recipes that make them chocolate chip cookies. If we were to see a whole slew of things that are completely different, a whole bunch of additions or variations, I'd reason to say that maybe it isn't so clear on if there is a true chocolate chip cookie formula out there. But from this, it seems like it is very clear that there are agreed upon elements to a chocolate chip cookie. These recipes are very different, yet very similar if you just go straight ingredient list. So, I think that is very interesting, and my spreadsheet is actually going to be on my blog, my website, which will be linked down below so you can get a better idea of what the spreadsheet looks like. I know I just sort of went briefly over it here. I will kind of give you a look at what these recipes in my spreadsheet is going on. But I hope you enjoyed, and thank you so much for flocking and squawking with me. I hope you will again sometime, and I'm thinking that I might have to go through my spreadsheet and bake up all these different chocolate chip cookie recipes, so let me know if you'd like to see that. Also, let me know what your favorite chocolate chip cookie recipe is. So, thank you so much for watching, and have a fantastic day.